Okay, so sometimes you see a headline and you're just like, whoa, hold on. What's going on there? And that's exactly what happened when I saw this news coming out of Nigeria.
Yeah.
Africa's biggest oil producer.
Right.
And we are going to do a deep dive today into an emergency declaration in Rivers State.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. We've been going through all the reports from AP News and Punch newspapers and really trying to get a handle on what's been happening.
Yeah.
So for everyone listening, the mission here is to really understand this situation as quickly and thoroughly as we can, like going beyond just the headlines and getting into some of the nuances and the details that you might not pick up just from a quick glance.
Exactly. Yeah, because this doesn't seem like the kind of thing that just happens overnight.
No.
So let's sort of unpack this a bit. And it seems like from the reporting that there's been a political crisis brewing in Rivers State for months now.
Yeah, there's definitely been some tension building between the current governor, Similayo Fubara, and a good chunk of the state lawmakers.
Okay.
And the interesting thing here is that it seems like a lot of these lawmakers are really closely tied to the previous governor.
Oh, interesting.
So you've got this element of, maybe some old loyalties and some political maneuvering going on in the background.
Yeah, so you have that as the backdrop. And then what was the thing that really kicked off this emergency declaration?
Well, the spark seems to have been when some of these lawmakers actually started impeachment proceedings against Governor Fubara.
Oh, wow.
And these weren't, small potatoes complaints. They were talking about some pretty serious accusations, like stuff related to the state budget and even how the legislative chamber itself was set up.
Okay, so a pretty serious challenge to his authority. But then the federal government's response was even more dramatic.
Yeah, it really was. President Bola Tinubu, he declared a state of emergency in Rivers State, and AP News really emphasized how rare this is. They called it a rare emergency rule. And this was all announced on Tuesday.
Okay.
And it's worth pointing out, this kind of move, it really bypasses those normal democratic ways of dealing with political disagreements.
Right.
So it kind of shows you how worried the federal government must be about keeping things stable there and protecting that oil infrastructure.
Yeah, it makes you think, what's the bar for this kind of intervention?
Right, exactly.
So it wasn't just talk, right? This declaration had some real immediate effects.
Oh, absolutely. This led to some key officials being suspended right away for 6 months. We're talking Governor Fubara himself. All the state lawmakers involved.
Wow.
And Punch newspapers even added that the deputy governor, Professor Ngozi Odu, was suspended too. So a big chunk of the state's leadership is basically sidelined.
That's a sweeping move. It's essentially like hitting pause on the entire executive and legislative branches at the state level.
Yeah, pretty much.
So what did President Tinubu actually say about why he took such a drastic step?
Well, from the reports, he pointed to that ongoing political crisis as a major worry. But he also really highlighted the vandalism happening to those oil pipelines.
Right, and if you zoom out and remember that Nigeria is this huge oil producer globally, any disruptions to that infrastructure, that has a ripple effect way beyond just Rivers State.
Oh yeah, national and international implications for sure.
So it wasn't just about local politics. This was about a threat to a crucial resource for the whole country.
Right, and the sources even gave us a specific recent example about those pipelines.
Oh yeah, what was that?
So the president, he specifically mentioned a blast that caused a fire on the Trans-Niger pipeline. And AP News said this all happened less than 24 hours before he made his announcement.
Oh, wow.
So you can see how urgent this felt to him and the kind of economic damage he was worried about.
So it really was a combination of those political clashes and then this tangible threat to a really important resource.
And did they actually quote President Tinubu directly about why he felt he had to intervene?
They did. AP News quoted him as saying that no good and responsible president will stand by and allow the grave situation to continue without taking remedial steps prescribed by the Constitution to address the situation in the state. Okay, so very much framing it as, this is a critical situation demanding federal action. I have to step in.
Exactly.
But it went beyond just those suspensions. There was a big new appointment too, right?
Yeah, they appointed a military administrator for Rivers State, and that's former Navy Chief Vice Admiral Ibuket Ibis. He's retired now.
Oh.
But it's important to note that President Tinubu specifically said that the judiciary is supposed to keep working.
Okay, so the courts are still running, even with the political leadership being suspended.
Right.
And I remember reading that there was a pretty visible show of force right after the announcement.
Oh, yeah. Both AP News and Punch newspapers talked about military trucks being sent to the Rivers State government house, right after President Tinubu said all this.
Wow. So a very clear sign that the federal government is taking charge of the situation.
Absolutely.
So this all seems pretty extraordinary in a country with, democratic structures. So what does the Nigerian constitution actually say about this kind of emergency rule? And how does this compare to other times they've done this?
Well, the Nigerian constitution, it does allow for a state of emergency to be declared, but only in very specific situations.
Yeah.
Mainly to keep public order and safety.
Yeah.
And AP News pointed out how rare this is. This is the first nationwide declaration like this in over a decade.
Wow.
And in a country with over 210 million people.
Yeah.
So it's not something they do lightly.
Yeah.
And Nigeria has this history where, they've had times of military rule and the democratic institutions have been tested. So any kind of declaration like this is a big deal.
Yeah, it really highlights the country's journey and how important those constitutional safeguards are. And we did have a kind of similar situation fairly recently, didn't we?
Yeah, back in 2013, under President Goodluck Jonathan, they declared a state of emergency in the northeastern states because of the Boko Haram insurgency.
Right.
But here's the thing that makes the River State situation so interesting. If we're trying to understand what's different this time.
Yeah, what's the key difference?
Back in 2013, even with this huge threat from Boko Haram, the state governors in those areas, they weren't suspended. So President Tinubu's decision to suspend the governor and all those other officials this time around, it's a big departure from how they handled things before.
Right. So it seems like they're looking at this crisis as more serious, or at least requiring a different response.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what could explain that shift in approach.
Right. It really underscores how seriously the federal government is taking the situation. So what was the reaction to all of this?
Well, one of the first groups to speak out was the Nigerian Bar Association, the professional group for all the lawyers there. And they did not hold back. They basically said right away that suspending the governor and those other officials was illegal.
Really?
Yep, they were very clear about that.
So what was their reasoning behind that criticism?
So the president of the association, Afam Osigwe, he basically said that just because there's a state of emergency declared, that doesn't automatically give the federal government the right to just get rid of or suspend elected state governments.
Okay, so a pretty strong legal argument against what the federal government just did.
Yeah, it definitely could end up in court.
Sounds like it. So what about the governor himself? Has he responded at all?
He has, actually, Governor Fubara. He made his first public appearance since the suspension was announced.
Okay.
Punch newspapers reported on this, and this was on Sunday, March 23rd, 2025.
And where did he show up?
He went to a church service at the headquarters of Salvation Ministries in GRA Port Harcourt, and he had his chief of staff, Edison Ehi, with him.
Interesting. So even though he didn't make like a formal statement, just being seen out in public with a close ally, like that probably sends a message.
Right. It suggests he might not be going down without a fight.
So to sum all of this up, we have this very rare state of emergency declared in River State, this important oil-producing region in Nigeria. And this comes after months of political tensions, impeachment proceedings against the governor, and those serious incidents with the oil pipelines being vandalized.
Right.
And the federal government's response has been to suspend the deputy governor and the lawmakers. And they put a military administrator in charge. And this whole thing has sparked some really strong pushback from legal experts. And it's a very different approach from how they handled that last national state of emergency.
Totally.
So for listeners, this whole situation really gives you a look into the political dynamics of a major player in Africa and how those dynamics can potentially affect global energy markets.
Yeah, and the really fascinating thing to think about here is how this situation shows that ongoing struggle to find balance within Nigeria's federal system.
Right.
Trying to balance that federal power with the power of the states. And when you think about how different this is from 2013, when they didn't suspend those elected governors, it really raises a question.
Yeah, what's the question that our listeners should be thinking about?
Well, what might the long-term consequences of suspending these elected officials be for River State and for Nigeria as a whole? For their stability, for their democracy. What does it say about the balance of power between the different levels of government? And what kind of precedent does this set for the future? Will the federal government be more likely to step in like this again in other states?
Right.
It's complicated. There's a lot of layers here, and the consequences could be huge. It's definitely a situation to keep your eye on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for helping us break all of this down.
Of course. It's been a pleasure.
And for our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this really complex and evolving situation in Nigeria. And be sure to check back in with us as we continue to follow this story and many others.
Definitely. We'll keep you updated.
All right, thanks again, and we'll talk to you all soon.
See you later.